For most powerlifters, the deadlift makes up the biggest part of their total, and that's exactly why hitting a wall with your deadlift feels like such a massive problem. Now, there are so many reasons why people plateau in this lift, and trying to figure out which one applies to you can drive you nuts. So in this video, I'm going to walk through some of the most common reasons I've seen in my 13-year career for why people plateau in the deadlift, how to know which one applies to you, and what to actually do about it. And no, the answer is never just switch to sumo. So let's start with the first reason, not keeping standards high with technique. Now, the deadlift's one of those lifts where it's really easy to just let your positioning slip. That bottom position, the setup, is tough to hold, and when fatigue kicks in, lifters often start standing up a little bit higher just to make the lift a bit easier. The problem, the lift might feel super fast off the floor, but it actually slows down massively towards the lockout. And this is when people refer to the lockout as being a sticky lockout. Sometimes that's a mindset issue. Sometimes the training prescription is just too hard for the lifter to stay technical. There are a lot of lifters who think it's fine to finish sets with slightly worse technique towards the end, when actually for the deadlift it's probably not. When you train with technical breakdown in deadlift, you're literally practicing how to move in a slightly different way. You're essentially reinforcing that version of the lift. If your form collapses, by definition, that was already RPE 10, because within that specific form, you weren't strong enough to lift with that bar, that repeated movement. In competition, it's going to be a different story. Sometimes you got to do whatever it takes to get the bar up and get 3 white lights. But in training, you need to hold yourself to a higher lifting standard. Sure, you can squeeze out more reps by letting the form go, but at that point, it's a different movement entirely, like comparing a full squat to a half squat. So let's move on to the next reason. Reason 2 is not being honest with your RPEs. Now, this one's big. A lot of lifters judge RPE based on the fastest part of the lift, not the slowest, and that's a mistake, because the slowest point is where the sticking point lives, and you've got to be self-aware enough to be able to admit that. Don't let that hype of hitting a PB make you underrate your RPE. If you're on a cookie cutter program, this can make you overreach too soon and dig yourself into a fatigue hole. And the reason why I say that is because by definition, a cookie cutter program is already a predetermined program, and there may already be a progression going on in an oncoming weeks. If you're being coached, you're sending your coach the wrong feedback signals. Yes, you can say that it is your coach's responsibility to call you out for it, but now I'm calling you out for it through the screen. Bottom line, honesty with RPE is honesty with your recovery. You track your strength in real time based on your E1RM projections from your loads and your RPEs. If you lie to yourself with your RPEs, you're lying to yourself about the reality of where your strength is in real time. You may be getting yourself in a position where instead of deloading, you're still pushing yourself into a deeper fatigue that you will eventually have to pay off. Worst case scenario, you get injured from doing too much of this long term. Let's move on to the third one, which is not deadlifting frequently enough. So there's this really common idea in the community where people think that the deadlift is inherently a more fatiguing lift. So people only end up doing it once a week. And then on top of that, people also think that the squat carries over to the deadlift anyway, so that they can spend more time doing squats rather than more deadlifts. The thing is, that's not totally wrong, but it really depends on you as a lifter and how much that transference the squat has to your body. Now, if your deadlift and squat positions look totally different, the carryover may be minimal. Yes, both lifts use the same muscles, so the quads, glutes, adductors, but the joint angles, muscle lengths, and the relative differences in tension and stress profiles on muscle groups are going to be different. So if you're stuck in a position where your squat is running away with good progress, but the deadlift progress is a bit lackluster, try adding a low fatigue, low intensity deadlift day, something like 2 sets of sub RP5 around 3 to 6 reps. Try and start light, then build it up in intensity gradually across a block whilst keeping the sets and reps the same. So then you can monitor the effects of that intensity on the progress over the weeks. On top of that, you may also want to keep the relative stress of your main deadlift day consistent and see how that extra frequency starts moving the needle. So if your main deadlift day originally looks like 3 sets of 4 at RP6, for example, then keep that roughly consistent to see how the new deadlift day impacts its performance on your main deadlift day. It's useful to drive the intensity of the new day high enough to see very clear trends in downward performance of your main day from excessive fatigue. This will allow you to see the maximal recoverable dose in terms of the intensity for that deadlift day. If it gets to the point where it continues to get stronger, you may want to experiment with a little bit more volume on that new day too. The fourth reason that people hit a wall in their deadlift is deadlifting too heavy too often. Now, to understand this, you've got to think about the stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation curve. Now, every hard session creates fatigue, a temporary drop in strength. You recover from that, and that's when you get stronger, and that's super compensation. If you hit another heavy session too soon before the recovery is done, you're not adapting, and you're just digging yourself into a deep hole of fatigue. You will know this is happening if your estimated 1 max starts trending downwards, even though you're training hard. This ultimately means that you're accumulating fatigue faster than your rate of recovery. And here's the kicker. Deadlifting heavy too often limits how much meaningful volume you can perform, which can reduce the stimulus that upholds your previous strength levels. A really good analogy is trying to sprint your way through a marathon. One thing that's also worth remembering is that everyone's tolerance to intensity is going to vary. For instance, for the same sets, reps, and intensity, it may take one lifter 4 days to recover back to baseline, whereas it may only take another lifter 2 days. And this could honestly be due to genetics, training age, as well as sex as well. So just because you see another lifter being able to recover from it doesn't mean that you can too. So the fifth one is too much top top end intensity exposure. Yes, intensity matters. Top end intensity just simply refers to the highest equivalent percentage of one max that you end up working to. You need heavy loads to train the skill of producing high force, as well as how you orient your body around a barbell that is relatively heavier than you. But intensity is obviously a double-edged sword. The heavier the load, the fewer quality reps that you can do, and past a certain threshold will create too much immediate fatigue. As there are individual differences, this threshold will vary from person to person. So doing singles, doubles, and triples are great tools to have in a program, but if done at too high of an intensity, your working sets will suffer. You will either get more fatigued and push the back of sets higher in RP than intended, or you'll have to drop the load so much that the overall stimulus of that session becomes less stimulating for future performance. In the past, I've seen lifters instantly start progressing again after I've removed that top set completely from their training days. Sometimes less top end intensity exposure is the key. So then the question is, how can you tell if a top end intensity exposure is too much? Well, here's a useful tip. Perform a top set, repeat that set again of the same load after rest, and see how much that RP has changed for that same load. Run this protocol across a block with progressively increasing intensity. For example, week 1, single at RP5, then repeat the single. Week 2 at single at RP6, and then repeat the single, so on and so forth. And what you may find is that the repeat of that single or top set at certain intensities may provide a potentiating effect where the subsequent performance of that same load may end up being at a lower RP. As you work up in intensity, it may be the case that the second time performing that load, you may find that the top end intensity starts to go up. For example, if you do a single at RP8, you may find that that second time round of doing that weight may end up being RP9 or more. If after repeating that load, you find that the RP ends up climbing, then you know that the first time round, that intensity caused acute fatigue. And in terms of programming practical implications, this may provide you some sort of idea of what the top end tolerance is when it comes to intensity. Now, an important thing to realize is that this doesn't necessarily mean that you should never be exposed to that intensity, but you may want to take the other days into considerations when it comes to programming around that level of intensity. So moving on to the 6th reason why people hit a brick wall with their deadlifts, which is training accessories too hard. Now, everyone says take your accessories seriously, and yeah, you should. But a lot of people interpret that to train every accessory to failure, and that's where things can go wrong. Now, if we look at hypertrophy research, we obviously want to work to a closer proximity to failure in our working sets. Now, that's research in isolation. Now, there's a difference between maximizing for hypertrophy and optimizing hypertrophy training for powerlifting. Maximizing hypertrophy means chasing muscle growth at all costs, putting increasing muscle mass as the paramount objective. Now, optimizing hypertrophy training for powerlifting means training enough for muscle growth while still supporting the process of strength gains without crushing your recovery. Now, there's obviously a huge Venn diagram that describes the adaptations that occur for strength gains and hypertrophy gains. But if you push hypertrophy too hard, you could cause too much muscle damage, which temporarily reduces that force production excessively as well. So if you're in a situation where there doesn't seem to be any other obvious contributors to why your lifts are tanking, but it also seems to be that whenever you push your accessories a little bit harder, your main lift seems to tank a little bit, then that may be why. Just because you're not maximizing all variables for hypertrophy does not mean that no muscle is being built. You have to keep the goal at the end of the day. Now, when it comes to practical implications, this doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't train your accessories to failure. It just may mean that you may have to relocate some of your accessories to other days, or you may have to reduce the RPEs or even the number of sets that you do for those prime mover muscle groups. Now, let's move on to the 7th reason why people hit a wall with their deadlifts, which is bad training splits or interference from squats specifically. Now, unlike bench press programming, you need to take into account of squat programming when it comes to programming the deadlifts. Both lifts hammer very similar muscle groups, specifically the quads, glutes, and adductors. So whatever fatigue that you create with squats can bleed into your deadlifts. If you've got a heavy squat day right before a heavy deadlift day, don't be surprised if your pull feels like trash. Sometimes the solution is simple. You could move your heavy squat day further away from your heavy deadlift day. You could shift some squat volume to another day, or if your schedule allows it, rebuild the split entirely so that each lift gets the space that it needs. You can even redistribute volume depending on how close the sessions are. So the closer the sessions, you may want to reduce the volume. The further apart they are, the more front-loaded the volume can be. So let's move on to the 8th reason why people may hit a wall with their deadlifts: living with this low-level discomfort or injury. This is where the region beta paradox comes into play. It's the idea that sometimes people recover faster from big problems than small problems, because when it's minor, it doesn't push you far enough out of your comfort zone for you to actually do something different with your training. You just learn to live with it, and that low-level injury subtly limits your effort or your positions. So if that's actually you may want to start by actually acknowledging it and being honest with what is actually going on. Ask yourself, does this pain show up past a certain load or RPE, or after a certain number of reps or sets? And if that's the case, you may be looking at a load management or technique issue. If it is a load management issue, then you just need to dial back the training dose and use those pain thresholds as constraints to train within. Fundamentally, you can't build strength on top of dysfunction. So when it comes to addressing deadlift plateaus, the goal isn't just to hack the deadlift. deadlift by doing things like swish and stance. It's actually to remove the bottlenecks that are actually holding you back. So I hope you guys found that video useful. Click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.